It's so good to see all of you today. I'm very excited. This is like my dramaturgical dream come true. I am going to read the bios of our amazing librarian guests to fully honor the archive. We have with us today two librarians from the Schaumburg. We have Maira Liriano, who is the Associate Chief Librarian of the Jean Blackwell Hudson Research and Reference Division at the Schaumburg. The Schaumburg is a research unit within the New York Library System, so we'll be hearing a bunch about that. And Maira manages the book collection and reference services. Prior to joining the Schaumburg, she worked at the U.S. History, Local History, and Genealogy Division of the New York Public Library, the Chicago Public Library, and George Washington University. Maira was born and raised in New Jersey and is one of 5 daughters from immigrant parents in the Dominican Republic. With Maira, we have A.J. Mohammed, who is a librarian, also in the Jean Blackwell Hudson Research and Reference Division at the Schaumburg. AJ has also worked at NYU's Bopst Library and Access Services. And in addition to being librarian, AJ is a fellow dramaturg. Most recently, he was the dramaturg for Multistage Theater's 2015 premiere of the play Comida de Puta, a modern-day adaptation of Euripides' Hippolytus by Desi Morano-Penson. A long association with the educator, theater director, and activist Daniel Banks has allowed AJ to serve as dramaturg for a lot of Daniel's projects in the U.S. and internationally. AJ is also the associate producer of outreach and marketing for the award-winning The Fire This Time Festival, which provides a 2-year platform for emerging playwrights of African and African-American descent. Season 8 of The Fire This Time Festival runs from January 16th to February 5th in 2017. So keep an eye out for that because it is a really exciting festival. And I'd love to welcome you up to the stage.
Good morning.
So to get us started, I would love, Maira, if you could tell us a little bit about the history of kind of briefly, generally the history of libraries in the United States, and then more specifically the development of the Schaumburg as a project in New York City.
Sure. I mean, I'm not really going to get into the history of libraries in the United States. That would take us more than what we have today. But one of the things that I know when we were preparing for this that I mentioned that sometimes I feel like it's lost is that public libraries is an American creation. It's an American institution, and it's actually one of the things that have come from our history that I think we can be the most proud of. Public libraries is, something that Americans, for the most part, have supported from almost from the founding of the United States, and has made. Has created public libraries, throughout the country in communities. It's really meant to be a local resource that's free and open to everyone who lives there. And libraries just provide a way for people to educate themselves, to learn about things beyond their worlds, and to imagine something different for themselves. And I think there's so many important people in our history, creative people, and Daniel is one of them, that can claim that the public library was a major influence in their lives and in their art. So I think that's what I want to say about American, especially public libraries. And then other countries then started creating public libraries in their countries, but it really originates, that idea of a free public library is really an American concept. The Schomburg Center is, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture was founded within a branch of the New York Public Library. So on 135th Street in Harlem, there was a branch of the public library, and in 1925, this is at the height of the Harlem Renaissance. Many African Americans had been moving to Harlem since the beginning of the century, and by that point, it became really obvious that there was a need for materials within the public library to serve the community that was living there at that time and still live there now. But there wasn't enough material. So the African Americans were coming in and asking for authors and history and other kinds of information that they weren't finding in the public library. So the branch librarian recognized that there was this need, and with many people in the community, they sought to create the Division of Negro History, Literature, and Prints, which happened in 1925. So they created the division, but then they needed the materials for the division, so they went to the man that they knew had the best library collection, and his name was Arthur Schomburg. And Arthur Schaumburg was a bibliophile, historian, activist that lived in Brooklyn, worked down in Wall Street, and worked in a mailroom at a bank. But his passion and he spent all his time outside of work was amassing a collection that documented the Black experience globally, and he immigrated to New York from San Juan, Puerto Rico, which is where he was born, and in 1891, and he says that the reason he started doing what he did, collecting, was that when he was a child, when he was in 5th grade, there was a teacher that said to him, they had an assignment to write a biography of somebody famous, and the teacher told him that Black people didn't have a history, they didn't have heroes, they didn't have any great moments, and he set out to prove that teacher wrong, and that became his life mission. So Arthur Schomburg so the library ended up purchasing his collection of 10,000 items for $10,000 with the help of the Carnegie Foundation, and that was the beginning of the Schaumburg Library. And then after that, they continued to support it. It was still a special collection within a branch. Arthur Schomburg became the curator in the 1930s until he died in 1938, and then it was named for him at that time after he passed away. And then in 1972, it was still a special collection within a branch, even though it was, by that point, it was really the biggest and most comprehensive Black collection probably in the world. And at that point, the library recognized that it needed to be a part of the research libraries, and that's when it became a research branch of the New York Public Library.
Great. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you do there? Like, what does a research librarian do at the Schomburg?
Sure. So we very much we try to follow in the footsteps of Arthur Schomburg and the many other librarians that followed and that worked with him and followed him, such as Jean Blackwell Hudson, who ran the Schomburg Center for 30 years and actually is responsible for the building that we currently sit in, because the branch library was pretty small. So as the Schomburg collection grew, we needed more space. So she managed to raise funds for that, and we got a new building in 1980. But as a librarian, and of course I work with many colleagues, because the Schomburg Center we collect books and periodicals and newspapers, and we also have manuscripts and archives and rare books, and we have moving image and recorded sound, and we have photographs and prints, and we even have art and artifactual materials. And Schomburg was actually responsible for that, because a lot of libraries don't have art collections, but he was very interested in art, and he collected art, and he was friends with many of the artists in Harlem at that time, including Aaron Douglas, who painted these amazing murals that we have in our reading room, Aspects of Negro Life. There's 4 panels that are enormous that are hung in our reading room. But so there's a lot of work that we do, but basically the core is to collect and preserve and provide access to these collections. So it's really important that we continue to collect materials that's by and about people of African descent. We have materials from all over the world, including a lot from Africa and the Caribbean and Brazil, all over. And so we work really hard to connect people to that material, you know, whether it's something that was collected from the past or something that we're currently collecting, and then the offshoot of that is the collections kind of informs everything else that the Schaumburg does, and the Schaumburg is more than a library. It's really it's a cultural center and it's a community center. So we offer lots of ways to educate people about what's held in the collection. So we have public programs, exhibitions, lots of educational programs. One of them is happening right now. We have Junior Scholars, which is a Saturday enrichment program for children ages 11 to 18 who come every Saturday during the school year and learn about Black history and culture, and they work on art projects. And it's a free program for kids, and it's been around for 15 years. I don't know if you want to add something, AJ.
I was going to add, when Maira was talking about the history of of how the Schomburg Center started, I wanted to point out in 1925, Nella Larson was a librarian at the 135th Street branch, and so that was an interesting fact that I learned recently about the history of the Schomburg Center. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that I'm glad that you referenced the public element and the arts element of the Schaumburg in particular, that we tried to do with the show is really think about the relationship between access to a space like that and the imagination. And AJ, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the presence of theater and the history of theater development at the Schaumburg.
I'm still learning a lot about the history myself because this is such an incredible history. But one of the wonderful things that I learned about the Schomburg Center was that in 1940, from 1940 to 1945, the American Negro Theater, which was created in 1940, was in residence at the original at the 135th Street branch. And in reading up for today, so I can sound I just try to sound coherent. I was reading a book by Jonathan Shandell, who's a theater historian, and apparently what I learned in going through the material was that before the A&T in 1940, there were other theater organizations that performed or used the 135th Street branch as their performance venue, and so there was a history even before the American Negro Theater set up shop in 1940, but the American Negro Theater, as I said, was started in 1940, and it was started by Abram Hill, and also Frederick O'Neill, who was a performer. And they started this. It was a company of 18 other artists as well. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to provide an opportunity for African American artists to be able to train or train on their craft, and also to produce productions of plays that were written by African American writers. And some of the original members of the American Negro Theater include Ruby Dee, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier joined later. I'm not sure if he was an original member. Also, the filmmaker and journalist William Greaves, he was also a member. Helen Martin was also a member, and Alvin and Alice Childress, who were a couple. And Alice Childress, she was a performer, and then she evolved into a playwright. And if I'm getting any facts wrong, we have Morgan Jeunesse here, who's a legendary dramaturg and theater historian herself. Y'all can correct me. So, and also, I'm just really. What'd you say?
It all sounds good.
Yeah, nice.
Morgan, just correct me, or if anybody else knows, it's such an amazing history. And also during that 5-year period, when the American Negro Theater was at the Schomburg Center, they produced original plays that were written during that time. One of the plays, one of their most famous plays was a play called Walk Hard, and it was at the Walk Hard and also on Stryver's Row. and it was a comedy of manners about a satire about the African American bourgeois in Harlem, and it was one of their most successful productions. They did three revivals of that play, and there was a musical theater adaptation done of it as well. And incidentally, Metropolitan Playhouse, which is right on the other side of the wall, they did a production of Walk Hard last season, and they'll be doing a production of On Scribner's Row in the spring of 2017. So if you want to see a play from the American Negro Theater, they'll be doing it in the spring. So, and it's an incredible piece, which was revived recently at Manhattan Marymount College. And as also as part of the American Negro Theater, there were three components. There was the play production component. There was also a radio program that they produced from in the mid 1940s called A Change Is Coming, and it ran for 2 years. And during the radio program, they did radio plays. So there were operas, short plays, and other types of works. And there was also a theater component of the American Negro Theater where people from the community could train. They could train on the craft of acting, playwriting, movement, etc. So, and also one of their most famous productions was a play called Anna Lucasta, which transferred to Broadway, and it ran for 2 years, and it also toured internationally. And there were other plays that transferred from A&T in Harlem to downtown. So, it's just, you know. That idea of the utopia, of the library as a utopia, I think it really it has a new meaning, because that was one of the places where that was one of the theater organizations where it was an interracial company, and the plays were performed by Caucasian and also African American actors. So I think that was really in terms of thinking about utopia, what was going on during the pre-civil rights America, where in some theaters downtown, the seating was segregated, but here in Harlem, you have this venue where you have multiracial actors and audiences coming to see theater.
Do you want to mention James Baldwin's relationship?
Sure. In fact, I actually have my phone with me because I wanted to read a quote. So, the Schomburg Center, being that it was this incredible collection, attracted many people to it, and especially anyone who lived in New York and lived in Harlem. And so there are very, very famous people, and AJ mentioned several of them already, in relation to the American Negro Theater, who used the collections and who used the space. And James Baldwin is someone that, constantly talks about the fact that he spent his childhood in the library, in the public library on 135th Street. And basically got his education at the Schomburg Center, and he says that was his alma mater, because James Baldwin didn't go to college, and so he learned everything basically from reading. I'm going to read the quote because he'll say it better than I can. I'll use his own words. So this is from an interview that appears in the documentary The Price of the Ticket. And I'm quoting him directly. So James Baldwin says, "I went to the 135th Street Library at least 3 or 4 times a week, and I read everything there. I mean every single book in the library. In some blind and instinctive way, I knew that what was happening in those books was also happening all around me, and I was trying to make a connection between the books and the life I saw and the life I lived." So for him, the library was a sanctuary, and it's where he sort of fed his mind, and then was able to then take that and create all the wonderful writings that he produced in his lifetime. So, the library and public libraries are a really powerful place that allows people to go beyond what they're learning in school or what they're being told at home. They can kind of seek their own paths and have that freedom to learn whatever it is they want to learn. And then the responsibility of librarians is to provide, the variety of information, uncensored, just providing as much a wide scope of knowledge of the world so that anyone can just follow their own path and not, directing people to, you must read this or you must, it's really providing that variety.
Yeah.
I think we got time for one more question.
Great, then I'm gonna open it up to you all. Does anyone have a question? Anything? They've seen the show too, if you wanna ask something specific to the show. Yes?
I don't know if this is directed enough for what we're doing here, but I've been always very interested in Ed Bullins.
Playwright Ed Baldwin.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
yes.
he disappeared, went up to Harlem and then disappeared to Oakland and just worked within the community. But I thought he was an extraordinary playwright. Was he ever a part of the mix of what the Schomburg was doing?
I know that there are, that's a good question. I know that his plays, of course, at the Schomburg Center, I know he was a part of, there was a theater group that was based in Harlem in the 60s during the Black Arts Movement. And I know that the plays were performed in Harlem, but I don't necessarily know if he was ever involved with the Schomburg Center. I'm interested in researching just to find the answer, but I don't know for sure. But as I said, I know that I'm sure it's possible. He probably had to have, because I think like the Schaumburg was like a crossroads. So at some point or another, it's possible that he may have had his work done at the Schomburg Center. But that's a really great question.
Thank you both.
And I was just going to say one thing, because going to the fact that I did see the performance. And so Daniel talks about a book written by a former slave named Harriet Jacob. And the book is The Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl that was published in 1961 and was part of the abolitionists publishing the lives of slaves.
1861.
1861, of course. And so Daniel mentions that he reads the book, and I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't seen it, but the book comes up, and it's something that he's reading as a child, and so the book was published in 1861, but doesn't get reprinted again until 1973. So over 100 years goes by, and there's no printing of that book until the 70s. And then actually in the late 80s, the Schaumburg released a whole series of books that they partnered with Oxford University Press that represented writings by Black women. A lot of works that had sort of been forgotten, that hadn't been reprinted or republished in many, many years. And so, there's so many stories like that, and the Schaumburg has many, many, many books that were never reprinted. There's just that one printing, and maybe the Schaumburg is the only place that has a copy of that, or there's only a few copies out there in the world. And so, it's reminded me that there's so many stories that are unknown to us, that are there for people to discover and hopefully bring to light.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to mention too, in the main, there's a collection at the Schomburg Center called the End of Life Archives, and it was started by Stephen G. Fullwood, who's a curator and an archivist and librarian, and it's an LGBTQ archive. So some of the writers that are mentioned in the play in the second act during the pageant, their papers are they're in this incredible collection. So I invite everybody to come to the Schomburg to go through the collections of these writers like Cheryl Clark, Jewel Gomez. Their papers are at the Schomburg Center, and I think I also wanted to get, as I said, I'm geeking out, so I just really wanted to mention, how incredible DUAT is in terms of bringing all that history and putting the history out there for, and if there's so many little tidbits of history and names and writers and scholars that are mentioned in the play, and the Schomburg is a great place for people to come to find out more about these historical figures. And I thank Daniel for bundling up in the play in such an amazing way. And I also wanted to say one of the things that stuck with me from Radiate, which was another show that Daniel did as Joe Mama Jones, was Joe Mama said that when she was a child, she had a library card in her purse, and also a switchblade named Trudy. So
The two most important things. Thank you.